There is a pattern in history that no empire has ever escaped. Not war, not recession, but the debt spiral, a six-phase, self-reinforcing cycle that begins with triumph and ends with collapse. Rome once dominated the entire Mediterranean. Britain once ruled a quarter of humanity. And the United States, the most powerful nation in modern history, is now repeating the exact same trajectory. Almost point for point, this isn't prophecy, it's mathematics. A mechanical sequence that has taken down every superpower that believed it was immune. It always starts with Phase 1, military strength and overwhelming growth. Then comes Phase 2, fiscal expansion. And Phase 3, borrowing to maintain the imperial lifestyle. But after Phase 3, something irreversible happens. Costs rise faster than output. Debt climbs faster than GDP. Inflation becomes a policy, not a problem. And the empire steps into the zone that no civilization has ever walked back from, Phase 4. Rome crossed Phase 4 when the denarius was debased to just 2% silver. Britain crossed Phase 4 when post-war debt soared above 250% of GDP. And the United States. In 2025, interest payments on the national debt surpassed the entire defense budget. That is always the first signal of Phase 4, when an empire must borrow just to pay interest on the borrowing that came before. Every civilization that reached this point kept going. None survived it. And here is the part that should terrify you. The US is standing exactly at that threshold, where the question is no longer will the debt spiral break, but rather how fast will Phase 5 and Phase 6 arrive. To understand what comes next, we have to go back to the empires that were swallowed by this same six-phase spiral. Starting with Rome, to understand how every empire enters the debt spiral, you have to go back to the moment before the collapse begins, the moment that always feels like peak strength. For Rome, that moment was the early 3rd century. The empire stretched from Scotland to Syria. Trade flowed through every port. Tax revenues from conquered provinces filled the imperial treasury. And the Roman denarius, a small silver coin, was the most trusted currency in the known world. On the surface, Rome had never looked stronger, but beneath that surface, the six-phase spiral was already forming, because empires rarely fall when they are weak. They fall when they are powerful enough to believe they can afford anything. In the year 235 AD, a new era began, later known as the crisis of the 3rd century. But back then, nobody called it a crisis. It began with something else entirely: expansion. Rome's borders were enormous, and enormous borders require enormous armies. Legions stationed in Gaul, Germania, the Middle East, North Africa, all of them demanding pay, equipment, food, land, pensions. The Roman military system was the largest employer in the ancient world, and every emperor, from Augustus onward, learned the same lesson. A Roman leader does not survive by cutting costs. He survives by spending more on the army than the man before him. This is where Phase 1 of the debt spiral quietly shifts into Phase 2. The treasury is drained to maintain security, to cover the gap. Emperors raise taxes, but tax revenue never keeps pace with military spending. Not in Rome, not in Britain, not in the United States. So Rome turned to the only tool every empire reaches for when revenues fall and expectations rise: money creation. At first, it was subtle, a slight reduction in the silver content of the denarius. A minor decrease the public wouldn't notice, but once one emperor did it, the next did it more. Within decades, the currency lost over 90% of its silver. What began as a fiscal adjustment became systemic debasement, the ancient equivalent of modern quantitative easing. And here is the part people forget. Debt spirals never begin with a single bad decision. They begin with dozens of tiny decisions that seem reasonable in the moment. Just reduce the silver content by 5%. Just mint a few more coins to pay the troops. Just borrow against future taxes. Rome told itself these were temporary measures. So did Britain in the 1940s. So does the United States today. By the time the denarius had been debased to near worthlessness, Rome had entered Phase 3 of the debt spiral, borrowing against tomorrow to survive today. Barbarian conflicts intensified, trade slowed, tax revolts erupted, and the Roman government did what every empire does at this stage. It doubled down. Bigger armies, bigger expenses, bigger deficits. The Roman public felt it first through rising prices. The empire felt it next through shrinking influence. But the treasury felt it most. The numbers simply stopped working, and once the numbers fail, Once the fiscal structure breaks, the empire cannot return to balance, not with austerity, not with tax increases, not with promises. This is the hidden beginning of the six-phase debt spiral, a moment when an empire still believes it is in control, while the mathematics are already turning against it. Rome never recognized that moment. Britain didn't either. And today, the United States stands in the exact same place Rome did in 235 AD. Powerful, confident, respected, and one step away from Phase 4, the point of no return. But to see how the spiral accelerates, we have to examine the empires that followed Rome and repeated its fate. History does not repeat itself word for word, but the structure of collapse does. Every empire that dominated global trade, global finance, or global military routes eventually entered the same six-phase debt cycle. Different cultures, different technologies, different eras, but identical mechanics. And once you see the pattern, you can no longer unsee it. Below are three empires separated by nearly 2,000 years, yet each walked through the same 6 stages, step by step, until nothing remained. Case Study 1. Rome, the empire that debased itself out of existence. Rome's decline wasn't a singular event. It was a sequence. Phase 1. Expansion and surplus. Rome's conquest brought in gold, slaves, land, and taxes. Surpluses paid for infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, and a massive standing army. Phase 2. Overspending and entitlement. As borders grew, so did Rome's obligations. Each new province required soldiers, administrators, and subsidies. Rome spent more maintaining the empire than the empire produced. Phase 3. Borrowing from the future. When taxes could no longer fund military payrolls, emperors debased the denarius. In 180 AD, it contained 75% silver. By 250 AD, less than 2%. A hidden tax, an ancient form of money printing. Phase 4. Inflation and military breakdown. Prices exploded. The army demanded payment in pure gold. Trade collapsed. Tax collection deteriorated. Rome had to borrow and debase just to function day to day. Phase 5. Loss of confidence. People abandoned the currency. Regions stopped sending taxes to Rome. The empire began fragmenting economically before it ever collapsed politically. Phase 6. Structural break. Invading tribes didn't destroy Rome. Rome destroyed its own financial system, and the rest followed. Rome's fall was not sudden. It was the cumulative effect of a debt spiral that lasted a century, but accelerated in its final decade. And Britain would repeat the same pattern, with eerie precision. Case Study 2. The British Empire. The superpower that drowned in war debt. Britain in the 1800s was the world's unrivaled economic engine. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. London was the financial capital of the world. And then the cycle began again. Phase 1. Expansion and dominance. British naval supremacy allowed London to control global trade routes. The empire profited from colonies, tariffs, manufacturing, and finance. Phase 2. Rising obligations. Maintaining the empire required a massive army, navy, and bureaucracy. Social programs expanded at home. Obligations outpaced income. Phase 3. War debt explosion. The Napoleonic Wars. Then World War I, then World War II. Each conflict multiplied Britain's debt burden. By 1945, debt reached over 250% of GDP. This is the point every empire begins to fracture. Phase 4. Currency strain and dollar dependence. The pound weakened. Britain was forced to borrow from the United States to survive the war. The Bretton Woods system replaced the pound with the US dollar. It was not a negotiation, it was a foreclosure. Phase 5. Imperial retrenchment. Britain dismantled its empire, not by choice, but by mathematics. The cost of global dominance exceeded the financial capacity to sustain it. Phase 6. Structural decline. Britain did not collapse violently. It shrank, quietly, into a mid-sized economy burdened with long-term debt. The map changed. The currency changed. But the mechanism was the same as Rome's. Overspend, borrow, debase, decline. And then came the third superpower, the one most people assume is invincible. Case Study 3. The United States, post-1971. The modern empire entering Phase 5. America's cycle began with unprecedented dominance. Phase 1. Global supremacy, 1945 to 1971. The U.S. controlled global trade routes, global finance, global oil markets. 2/3 of world gold reserves were in Fort Knox. The dollar was as good as gold. Phase 2. transitional overspending, the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, and Cold War expansion strained the budget. The U.S. spent more than it produced for the first time on a structural basis. Phase 3, the break from gold, 1971. Nixon closed the gold window. The U.S. began printing money without restraint, the modern version of Rome's Denarius debasement. Debt became the engine of growth. Every administration, Republican and Democrat, added more. Phase 4, debt surges beyond control. From 2000 to 2025, federal debt rose from $5 trillion to over $37 trillion. Interest payments now exceed the defense budget. The U.S. borrows money to pay interest on previous borrowing. This is the unmistakable signature of Phase 4. Phase 5, confidence begins to fracture. Foreign buyers reduce treasury purchases. Nations accumulate gold and alternative assets. The world quietly shifts away from dependence on the dollar. This is exactly how the pound sterling lost dominance in the 20th century, not in a dramatic crash, but through global reallocation. Phase 6, pending structural reset. Every empire reaches a point where the debt spiral terminates in a reset. Currency revaluation, restructuring, or strategic devaluation. Rome did it, Britain did it, America is approaching this stage now. 3 empires, 3 timelines, 3 outcomes identical in structure, and now the world's current superpower stands at the same crossroads. To understand what happens next, we must zoom in on the modern moment, because the United States is not at the beginning of the cycle. It is deep inside it, which brings us to the present, the U.S. today, entering the most dangerous phases of the spiral. Every great empire reaches a moment when the numbers stop working, when the mathematics of power diverge from the narrative of power. For the United States, that moment is no longer theoretical. It is here, it is measurable, and it is accelerating. To understand where America stands in the 6-phase debt spiral, we have to strip away politics, ideology, and optimism, and look at the raw financial structure of the empire in 2025. Because the U.S. today is not in Phase 2, not Phase 3, not even early Phase 4. The indicators show America straddling Phase 4 and Phase 5 simultaneously, the point where every past empire discovered the same truth. You can postpone arithmetic, but you cannot escape it. 1. The most critical metric, interest, defense for the first time in U.S. history. Annual interest payments exceed the Pentagon budget. Interest on the debt, 2025. Over $1.2 trillion defense spending, roughly $870 billion when an empire spends more to service old obligations than to project new power. The spiral has already flipped. Rome reached this threshold when Denarius debasement forced the army to demand gold instead of silver. Britain reached it when war debt consumed its entire fiscal surplus. The United States has reached it now, without a world war. This is the purest sign of Phase 4, when debt stops funding growth and begins consuming the system. 2. Debt growth has become exponential. In 1980, U.S. debt was $900 billion, in 2000, $5 trillion, in 2020, $23 trillion, in 2025, over $37 trillion, rising by $1 trillion every 100 days. It took the U.S. 205 years to accumulate its first trillion in debt. It now adds $1 trillion roughly every 3 months. This is not normal debt growth. This is Phase 5 acceleration, when the system requires ever-increasing borrowing just to maintain the appearance of stability. No empire has ever reversed from this phase. 3. Foreign buyers are retreating. Reserve currency status depends on the rest of the world buying your debt, but foreign demand is weakening. China has cut treasury holdings to the lowest level since 2009. Japan, long the largest holder, is selling to defend the yen. The Middle East is diversifying into gold and yuan-based contracts. BRICS is building dollar alternatives, payment rails, and settlement networks. The global financial system is not abandoning the dollar, but it is no longer unquestioningly dependent on it. This is how reserve currency declines always begin. Quietly, gradually, mathematically. When the world buys less of your debt, you must print more of it. This is Phase 5, confidence erosion. 4. Domestic politics guarantee higher debt. Rome could not cut military spending. Britain could not cut its imperial commitments. And the United States cannot cut Medicare, Social Security, or defense without political collapse. The fiscal structure is locked: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, interest. These 4 categories alone consume over 120% of federal tax revenue, meaning even if the U.S. cut every other government function to zero, education, infrastructure, FBI, NASA, highways, foreign aid, the government would still run a deficit. America is no longer borrowing because it chooses to. It is borrowing because it must. Once an empire reaches this stage, the spiral becomes self-reinforcing. 5. Inflation is no longer a bug, it is a tool. The U.S. cannot pay down $37 trillion in nominal terms. The only politically viable solution is the same mechanism used by every failing empire, inflation that slowly devalues the debt. Rome debased the denarius. Britain inflated away its post-war liabilities. The United States is now pursuing managed inflation, a polite phrase for invisible default. This is not mismanagement, it is strategy, a deliberate, controlled erosion of purchasing power to shrink the real burden of the debt. But inflation, once unleashed, rarely remains controlled, and that is where Phase 5 bleeds into Phase 6. 6. The final warning sign: growth no longer outpaces debt. An empire can survive high debt. It cannot survive debt growth that permanently outpaces economic growth. For the past decade, debt growth rate, NARS 8 to 12% annually. GDP growth rate, years 1-2% in real terms. The gap is widening. This is the fatal divergence that ended Rome, ended Britain's supremacy, and is now locking the United States into the final stage of the cycle. No nation in history has escaped this divergence, not one. Where America stands right now, the U.S. is exhibiting all the markers of a superpower deep in the late-stage debt spiral. Interest payments exceeding military strength, exponential debt growth, weakening foreign demand for treasuries, structural deficits that cannot be reversed, increasing reliance on inflation as a tool, political gridlock, monetary interventions masking insolvency. This is Phase 4 turning into Phase 5, the same hinge point that marked the irreversible decline of Rome and Britain. And the most important question is not how did we get here? It's what accelerates the spiral from slow decay into sudden collapse, because Phase 6 is never gradual. It arrives abruptly, triggered by one event: a war, a bond panic, a political fracture, a currency shock, or a loss of global confidence. And the world today is filled with more potential triggers than any time since 1945, which brings us to the next stage. Why this cycle is unfolding faster and more violently than any previous empire in history. Empires don't collapse because of debt alone. If they did, decline would be slow, predictable, manageable, but collapse is rarely slow. It is sudden, violent, triggered by acceleration, the moment when structural weakness meets external pressure, and the spiral tightens faster than the system can adapt. For Rome, that acceleration came from border invasions and collapsing trade. For Britain, it came from 2 world wars compressed into a single generation. For every empire, the trigger is different, but the physics are identical. And today, every force that accelerates a debt spiral is happening to the United States simultaneously, at a scale no empire has ever faced. 1. Technology speeds up capital flight. In past centuries, when confidence in an empire weakened, capital moved slowly. Gold caravans from Rome, sailing ships leaving London, diplomatic transfers between central banks today. Capital leaves in milliseconds. AI-driven trading, high-frequency algorithms, 24/7 digital markets. They allow trillions to move instantly at the first sign of stress. A rumor, a bond auction failure, a geopolitical shock, and electronic markets can drain liquidity faster than the Federal Reserve can respond. This speed is unprecedented, and it means that once confidence breaks, the U.S. won't have years or even months. It will have hours. This is the first accelerant. 2. Global reserve dependency amplifies volatility. When a small nation enters a debt crisis, contagion is limited. But when the global reserve currency enters crisis, contagion becomes universal. The dollar is the foundation of global trade, global commodities, global debt markets, global collateral, global banking reserves. This creates a paradox. The stronger the dollar's global role, the more catastrophic its failure becomes. No previous empire carried this level of systemic weight. Not Rome, not Britain. A dollar shock would destabilize every country that holds U.S. Treasuries, dollar-denominated, debt dollar-based trade contracts, dollar reserves. This makes the spiral exponentially faster. 3. The debt load is historically unprecedented. Rome's debt crisis was denominated in silver. Britain's debt crisis was denominated in pounds, but both crises were small in scale compared to the modern U.S. system. The U.S. carries $37 trillion in federal debt, $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities, $1 trillion in annual interest costs, a treasury market over $27 trillion deep, and all of this is resting on a global derivatives market exceeding $600 trillion in notional value. No empire in history has ever carried financial obligations this large, this leveraged, or this interconnected. This is why economists warn that the next debt spiral cannot unwind slowly. The system is simply too big and too fragile. 4. Geopolitical fragmentation removes the safety net during Britain's decline. The U.S. acted as a stabilizer during Europe's post-war crises. The U.S. acted as a backstop during the 2008 crisis. Central banks coordinated to prevent collapse. Today, global cooperation is unraveling. U.S.-China relations are adversarial. BRICS nations are building alternative currency systems. Middle Eastern powers are shifting away from petrodollar contracts. Europe is fractured economically and politically. Russia is disconnected from Western financial systems. In past spirals, the dominant empire had allies to slow or soften the decline. The U.S. today has only rivals and competitors. A debt spiral with no external stabilizers accelerates by default. 5. Political polarization eliminates policy options. Rome's Senate fractured in its final centuries. Britain's parliament splintered during its post-war decline, and the United States is entering its own era of political paralysis. High-debt empires require unified decisions: spending reform, tax reform, monetary coordination, geopolitical alignment. But Washington cannot agree on budgets, deficits, industrial policy, foreign policy, even basic fiscal arithmetic. A divided political system cannot solve a mathematical problem, and when problems cannot be solved, they must be postponed. And every postponement accelerates the spiral. 6. Demographics undermine the tax base. The U.S. is aging. Retirees are rising. Workers are stagnating. Birth rates are falling. This means higher Social Security costs, higher Medicare costs, lower tax revenue, lower productivity, slower GDP growth. Debt spirals accelerate when obligations rise faster than the workforce that supports them. This is exactly what happened to Rome's tax base in the 3rd century, exactly what happened to Britain after Walter, and exactly what is happening to the United States now. 7. The final accelerant. Loss of narrative control. Empires survive on confidence. Confidence in currency, in leadership, in institutions, in stability. But confidence is no longer shaped by government. It is shaped by social media, financial influencers, algorithmic news feeds, AI-generated narratives, global market perception. When trust erodes in real time, debt spirals move from theory to crisis with breathtaking speed. Rome lost confidence over decades. Britain lost confidence over years. The U.S. could lose confidence in days. The inevitable result: a faster spiral than any empire. Before, America is not facing a slow-motion decline. It is facing an accelerated version of the same cycle that toppled Rome and Britain, compressed by technology, multiplied by global dependency, amplified by debt, and unrestrained by political unity. This is no longer a historical pattern. It is a real-time process. And once an empire enters Phase 5 with accelerating forces from every direction, it moves toward one final destination, Phase 6, which brings us to the ending. The unavoidable outcome that every empire in history eventually reaches. Every empire believes it will be the first to escape the cycle. Rome believed it could debase without consequence. Britain believed it could borrow indefinitely because the world needed the pound. And the United States believes it can outgrow, outprint, or outmaneuver the arithmetic that dismantled every superpower before it. But the debt spiral has no exceptions. It has only timelines. The final phase is not dramatic at first. It never begins with collapse. It begins with transition, a quiet tipping point where the world stops treating the empire's currency as unquestionable and begins treating it as optional. This is Phase 6, structural reset. It unfolds in 3 movements. 1. The currency repricing. Every reserve empire reaches a moment when its currency is no longer the unquestioned anchor of global trade. For Rome, it happened when the denarius lost its silver and soldiers demanded to be paid in gold. For Britain, it happened when the dollar replaced the pound after 1944. For the United States, it begins when foreign nations stop increasing their treasury reserves and start diversifying out of them. This doesn't look like a crash. It looks like a shift, a slow migration of global value away from the center But once migration begins, it never reverses. 2. The internal adjustment phase, 6, forces the empire to confront the mathematics it ignored in phase 4 and denied in phase 5. 3 outcomes are possible. Inflationary reset. The currency loses purchasing power rapidly. Monetary restructuring. Interest rates spike. The economy contracts. Debt is written down. Strategic devaluation. The government redefines money itself. In all cases, the debt burden shrinks, not because it was repaid, but because it was diluted, revalued, or destroyed. This is how Rome erased obligations, how Britain erased wartime liabilities, and how the United States, one way or another, will address its $37+ trillion burden. The numbers make this outcome unavoidable. 3. The geopolitical realignment phase 6 ends where every debt spiral ends, with a change in who leads the global system, not necessarily through war, not necessarily through collapse, often simply through exhaustion. Rome didn't fall in a single day. Britain didn't fall with a single event. They both faded, financially, militarily, psychologically, until the world reorganized around new centers of gravity. The United States will not disappear. Empires rarely do. But the role it plays, the center of global finance, the issuer of the reserve currency, the unquestioned guarantor of stability, will shift, not because another nation overtakes America through strength, but because the debt spiral weakens America from within. The same mechanism, the same math, the same ending. The final line, history is not prophecy, but history is pattern, and the 6-phase debt spiral has never failed to reshape the world that follows it. Rome couldn't escape it, Britain couldn't escape it, and the United States, standing between phase 5 and phase 6, cannot escape it either. The only variable left is timing, because once the spiral begins its final turn, it doesn't reverse, it accelerates. And that is why every empire that enters phase 6 reaches the same destination. Power doesn't end with collapse, it ends with transition. This is the pattern, and we are already inside it.